The house at 41 Winterglass Street did not take daylight, like other houses. Even in August, when the town of Greybridge lingered between corn gold fields and the slow river, this house held the light the way a clenched fist holds a nail, meanly, as if it meant to hide the sting. Mara Ellison stood on the curb with a thermos the color of storm water and a rolled plan tube tucked under her arm. She had been hired to survey the Winterglass property, a late 1800s pile with gingerbread trim, gone sawdy, and a widow's walk whose railings were too delicate for the bluntness of the roof. Her job most days was to listen. Buildings told her things. The whorls and old banisters remembered hands. Floor joists hummed with the measure of footsteps that were the house's heartbeat, the lived-in metronome of years. Even brick could talk if you put your ear to it and laid your pride down long enough to hear. This house spoke in subtraction. On the porch, the shade felt airless, as if someone had folded the afternoon in half and pressed it flat. Mara's key scraped the lock, a dry, papery sound. When the door opened, the scent found her: damp paper, iron filings, and something faintly medicinal, like poultices pressed to old wounds. The floor's wallpaper, once a pattern of green ivy, had bleached to a cataract's gray. Every frame hung a fraction too low. The house was listing, not in its foundations, but in its meanings. Morning, Mara said to no one. She said it because she always did, speaking to the breath and beam of an address as if it could be welcomed. The word broke a little on its way out. Her voice sounded thinner here. She began the walkthrough. Tape measure hiss. Graph paper. Notes about sills, transoms, sash cords flayed to floss. Her pencil caught and snapped at North Wall Settlement crack, the lead skittering like a fishbone. She frowned and sharpened it with the pocket blade her father had left her. The one with the nick where he'd miscut a sill when she was 8 and learning to square a frame by. In the dining room, something had peeled the paint in strokes like fingernail crescents. Beneath it, handwriting appeared, not written on the wall but pressed into it, as if the plaster had once been soft and had taken the impression of words. Don't forget to eat. The letters were shallow but unmistakable. Mara's chest pinched. People left marks like this on themselves, sometimes. Elastic on the wrist to remind you. Notes on phone lock screens. Gunmetal alarms. But walls? She stepped back. The room seemed to breathe in. Her ears popped, the way they did on the ferry when the fog pressed down and the horn sounded like a wound. She told herself the house merely trapped humidity. Then she heard the lightest scrape, a weight shifting above her, water in a pipe, surely in the echo of something like a sigh. Stay. Ridiculous. She annotated the dining room, took photographs, circled plaster relief text. Her job was to document. The rest mood room would belong to Dr. Roque, the historian, and to Jonah, if he came with his students to photograph the architraves for their unit on American Gothic. The town fed itself on stories the way old houses fed on heat. It wasn't her business to become a radiator for everyone's cold. Yet when she walked back through the foyer and out onto the porch, the sky had dimmed. A moment earlier, the river had flashed cones through the maples. Now it had gone to slate. It was noon. Mara checked her watch twice. No, she said aloud, and the porch rail said nothing back. She thought of a fault in her brains, knowing Vertigo's cousin. She steadied herself with the post. Something gave, not would but will, and the pork's shadow slid a little farther into the yard, as if stretching. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and told the house, "I'll be back tomorrow." The key turned reluctantly. Behind her, something in the foyer leaned toward the door, as it shut, curious or greedy. Walking to her truck, Mara had the sensation of being observed from an angle human eyes could not find. Not watch. Way. The sensation remained with her through the afternoon's errands, through the banal mercy of the grocery store's hum, and the clerk's board paper or plastic. It rode home with her like a passenger in the backseat, silent, heavy, patient. That night, when she turned off her bedside lamp, the darkness didn't arrive. It was already there, seated in the corner like a stranger, who had let himself in while she brushed her teeth. She did not sleep so much as sink. Greybridge had always been a town fond of temperate weather and unassuming tragedies. A factory that once made lace had burned to a lacework of blackened beams, a ferry ran to minutes late for 30 years, people stayed married long past the happiness, and called it heritage. The maples along the main drive budded a little later than the next town over. The river's fog arrived the way grief did, at night without sound, and too thick to argue with. Lately the fog had stopped leaving. Deputy Silas Crow noticed it because he noticed everything, because noticing made it possible to bear the weight of what could not be changed. He had a notebook the size of a pack of cigarettes, and he wrote in it daily, June 3rd, dog in back of 17 Elm still limping, check with Annika about the broken step on the library stairs, Mr. Penwell's porch light out. It was not policing so much as keeping a ledger against entropy. His pen hesitated over a new entry, people slower? It was a crime. Greybridge's crimes were prosaic, the occasional theft of copper, a teenager who'd used the old quarry for fireworks and lost his eyebrows to cautionary tale. This was something different. You could stand on the corner of Broad and Maiden at 8 in the morning and watch the town walk through air that had become thickened honey. Shoulders stooped as if things were being carried that couldn't be named in ordinances. Silas bought coffee at Creel's Diner and carried a second one across the street to Jonah Hale, who was hanging a banner that read, in hesitant hand lettering, "Poetry Night, Community Hall, Friday 7 p.m. The banner drooped. "Let me," Silas said, and put his broad palms around the rope, hitching it higher. Jonah nodded thanks, then squinted at the banner, as if trying to read something written behind the words. "You all right?" Silas asked. "Words feel far away today," Jonah said. "Like I know them, but I can't bring them into the room with me." He smiled or began to, and did not finish. New composition notebooks came in for the students. "They're the wrong blue." "What's the right blue?" Jonah looked at him baffled. "I can't remember." Silas handed him the coffee. "Try this. It doesn't fix stupid problems, but it annoys them so they leave you alone." Jonah laughed. The laugh ran out like weak battery. "You ever feel like someone's adding weight to things?" "Not a lot. A little at a time." "Chairs. Thoughts." Silas thought of his notebook, and the line he'd hesitated over. "I'll add a streetlight to the corner by City Hall," he said, "because that was what you could do when you couldn't fix whether you made light. And I'll talk to Evelyn Roke. She knows why towns get strange." They both glanced toward City Hall. The building's clock face had been slow by for minutes for as long as anyone could remember. Today, it had stopped. Dr. Evelyn Roke kept the town's paper memories in a room beneath City Hall that always smelled faintly of ozone and library paste. The archive wasn't secret, it simply preferred people who asked permission. The bulbs hummed. The metal shelves held decades of minutes, atlases with cracked spines, scrapbooks that had pressed flowers into a cellulose eternity. She spoke to them all the way you speak to old friends who get cranky when you wake them. The day Silas came, the hum had deepened. She could feel it beneath her sternum, the way a cello's second lowest string made your ribs into a small cathedral. "Is that the ballast dying?" Silas asked, squinting up. Evelyn cocked her head. "That's not electricity." He gave her a look. She gave him another. In Greybridge, it was impolite to be more literal than necessary. "What have you noticed?" she asked. Silas told her in clipped phrase fog that refused to leave. The clock's halt, people walking as if a hand pressed between their shoulder blades. He did not use the word sadness. Everyone had earned theirs privately and publicly. This was not sadness. It was a weather system with opinions. Evelyn set out 3 items on the long table: a map of the original settlement, a broadside announcing the opening of the lace factory in 1891, and a torn, much-handled page from a ledger kept by a woman whose job title had been overseer of morals. The ledger's ink had run in places, as if the words had been rained on from inside the page. "We had something like this once," she said. "The winter of 1902. The newspapers called it a pall." Silas waited. Not a fog. Not an illness. A pressure. People wrote fewer letters. Church services were shorter. I found 3 instances of people writing notes on their doors to themselves: eat, go to work, say yes, things the living forget when the world tilts. It lifted after 13 weeks. No one knew why it came, and no one knew why it left. How'd they keep going? Evelyn shrugged. "They did. And some didn't." He took that in. "If it's back." Her eyes were very steady. "Then we do what they did and better." When Silas had gone, the hum in the archive rose a half step like attention. Evelyn put her palm on the map. Beneath paper, beneath the cool of the table, beneath the floor, she felt net heat, not cold, but the specific temperature of a well that had forgotten the word for water. She whispered with a scholar's insolence, "What are you?" Something in the concrete answered in a voice too old to be a voice, "Hungry." Mara came back to Winterglass Street because not coming back felt like letting the world decide the shape of her days without her vote. She brought better light this time, a work lamp with a tripod, and the kind of sandwich you eat because your body is the worker and you are management, and it's contractually obligated. The house accepted her, the way a storm accepts a boat. The floor was cooler today. The dining room's pressed words were sharper. "Don't forget to eat. Call your sister. The plants need water. Stand up." They weren't a haunting. They were practical. The letters had the utilitarian earnestness of someone leaving notes for their future self in an hour of bleakness. The handwriting varied. More than one person had pressed the wall. Mara did what she always did: photograph, grid, measured. She sketched a diagram of the wall lathe behind the plaster. Nails had been set at 12-inch centers, but Hiresh tapped the wall with the back of her knuckle hair. They were at 9. She imagined the worker who had done that, a century ago, setting too many nails because the day had felt like it might otherwise slide off the edge of the earth. The house listened to her think. She felt the attention like a humidity. When she moved, the air moved a split second later, as if copying. At the base of the stairs, the runner had worn to threadbare. She put her palm flat against the newel post. The wood thrummed with a small music, children gone meals over, the relentless arithmetic of shoes, and beneath, in a lower register, a bass note, a weight that did not belong to any single life, but to the total of living. She took the stairs counting because counting felt like prayer without doctrine. At the landing, she heard a soft, regular sound almost like breathing, almost like Ish realized, start Litsamon counting too, but down not up. Hello, she called. The door at the end of the hall opened into a room with a single piece of furniture, an iron bedstead, paint flaked to reveal enamel the color of teeth. The window refused the sky. On the wall, new letters had pressed themselves into the plaster, crisp and shallow and unambiguous DONT. She stood very still. A draft moved the tiny hairs along her forearms. The floorboards beneath her had cupped, dried, cupped again. Something had sat on this floor for many years without moving much except to listen. Don't what? She asked. It was absurd. It was also the only honest question. The bed's iron footboard clicked softly, the way heat makes metal pop. From the corner, where the light failed, something like a shadow detached itself from the bigger shadow. It had the dimensions of a person but not the edges. No eyes, no face. Only the sense that if a hole in a hillside could stand and think, it would look like this, an absence of surface. The temperature did not drop. The temperature did not rise. Instead, all the temperatures came closer together. Mara's heart thudded and then steadied. She lifted her chin the way her father had taught her, when a beam looked unsound, and courage was cheaper than scaffolding. Is this your word? She asked the dark. Or someone else's? The dark moved without moving. It didn't approach so much as increase. The word on the wall seemed fresher now, as if written with a finger that had learned the shape of letters by tracing them on windows in winter. A sound like the weight of a blanket being laid across a sleeping body pushed at her ears. It was not unkind. It was not kind. It was inevitable. Don't. Mara repeated and realized, abruptly, that the word wasn't a warning. It was the whole of a sentence the writer had run out of strength to finish. Don't what? Don't forget. Don't leave. Don't speak. Don't bother. Don't breathe. The shape in the corner seemed pleased by her uncertainty. It swelled not outward but inward, increasing its density, as if it were made of all the unsaid things in town compressed until they could bend light. Mara did what builders do when faced with something that warps true lines. She stepped back, found her reference points. You can't have the verbs, she said, her voice hoarse. They're not yours. The shape recoiled as if shed flicked water at a cat. Not far, just enough to tell her that names mattered. She measured, photographed, and left. On the porch, the sky hammered with light. In the yard, the shadow of the house stretched and stretched until it touched the street. By Friday, Jana's students came to poetry night moving like astronauts under invisible load. They read their pieces into the mic, and the mic fed the room, a low feedback hum that felt like the archive's ballast dying. A girl named Priya read a sonnet about a refrigerator that held a single white plate, and an apple that kept rolling to the back where the light didn't reach. The sonnet's last line fell off the page. She stared at the ceiling afterward, as if waiting for something to give her permission to breathe. A boy named Mason brought a villanelle, and forgot the repeating lines halfway through. He wept without expression and said sorry to the floor. Jonah, whose job was to place his hands on the invisible shoulders of the room and lift, could not find purchase. He spoke to them afterward, soft and relentless as rain. What you feel is not your fault. It has a mouth and wants to call itself your name. You are not food. The words sounded good in his mouth and went nowhere, as if the air had been lined with felt. He walked home across the green. Midway he stopped. Between the elm trunks, something leaned on the night. Not silhouette, not man. The space it took up seemed to deepen the spaces around it, like a heavy book placed on a shelf that makes the shelf sag, and the lesser books slide toward it. You, Jonah said, surprising himself with the word's clarity. His throat ached as if he had swallowed snow. The shape did not advance. He felt its attention pass through him like a draft through a house whose windows were not properly squared. Behind his eyes, old fears uncoiled. His father's silence, a classroom where the books sat unopened like doors nailed shut, a winter when he'd made a list on his palm. Eat, read, text someone, open the blinds. He'd checked each item with a pen as if that was a life. He took a step forward anyway, because he taught courage in cowards' doses, and it had to be worth something. Get out of my town, he said. You don't get to rename us. The thing that was not weather did not laugh. If it had, it would have sounded like a drawer closing on a stack of letters that had not been read. It compressed. Jonah felt the pressure behind his heart, the way you feel your pulse when a dentist takes your wrist and says, hold still. He whispered, I know what you are. I've graded essays you wrote with my students' hands. He stood there until the shape eased back into the comprehensive dark, and the night came forward again like a brave friend who had been waiting for his cue. Mara woke to the kind of morning that arrived like a letter with no return address. She stood barefoot on her kitchen tile, a mug cooling in her hand, and stared at the little square of paper shed taped beside the light switch. Open the blinds. She read it aloud to no one. It was absurd, like narrating the act of breathing. Then she did them under the cord, wrist turning and the vinyl slats climbed, hissing in small increments until the window remembered sky. That tiny ascent blind stubby ladder pulled up rung by rung had the weight of a decision. The daylight looked thin, like broth you could see the bottom of the bowl through, but it was still nourishment. She added a new note beneath the first, warm food. Another, answer Evelyn. Her phone blinked with a message from the historian. Archive at 10, the ballast is singing. Mara almost typed not today, default liturgy of surrender, then caught herself, wept the words and texted on my way. The act of choosing fewer letters felt like choosing a shorter road through fog. Across town, Deputy Silas Crow had set two aluminum poles like spears into fresh dug sockets on Maiden Street and bolted on lamps whose domes looked a little too cheerful for the day. He tightened the last hex net and leaned back. The shadows beneath the new fixtures were crisp, insubordinate in a sensible way. The municipal switch engaged with a brittle snap, and light spilled in tidy cones that cut through the morning's wool. He ran a hand over the pole, as if soothing a horse. From somewhere down the block, he heard chalk on pavement. A child? He followed the sound to the curb by Creel's diner, and found a symbol drawn in a steady hand, a circle with a dot at its heart, very old cartographer's mark for a place worth noting. Silas touched the chalk gently and it smudged, leaving a white crescent on his thumb. He hadn't drawn it. He didn't think a child had, either. The line was too decisive. He took out his small notebook and wrote, "Find host making the marks. Ask if we can have more." Jonah Hale, at his classroom whiteboard, wrote the words imperative mood and circled them twice. His seniors blinked through the haze that had turned effort into weather. If the Paul eats verbs, he Sage used the word now because his students had. The way people once gave names to storm swell give it verbs in a form it can't digest. Like Corn Mason said, "Vos flat but wry." The class smiled, the kind of smile you manage when smiling is still under warranty. Exactly. Imperatives are commands, Jonah went on. They do not wait for permission. They are small engines. Today you'll write poems that consist only of instructions you would give a friend. Not advice, not feelings, actions. Priya raised her hand without lifting it far. What if the friend is me? Especially then, Jonah said. They wrote. The room shifted a few degrees toward breathable. As each student read a Lineston, sip water, put on socks, open the window, text-backed class seemed to remember it had hands. Jonah felt his own lungs work like bellows that had been rusted shut and were loosening under use. He collected the pages and stacked them like bricks. At 10, the four of them converged in the archive, the hum in the ceiling deep enough to be felt in the cartilage of the ear. Evelyn had laid out a table of relics that made time feel folded. A ledger kept by a woman in 1902 whose job had been to oversee morals, a title equal parts majestic and hopeless. A minister's letter from 1763 complaining about the weight that lay on the town like a lid on the soup, and a contemporary map with blue tape points where language had seemed to flow easier. I think it's the building itself, Evelyn said, tapping the concrete with one knuckle. We have a standing wave. These spots are nodes where the resonance makes words behave. So we can tune the town? Jonah asked, half yearning, half embarrassed by his own metaphor. Maybe, Evelyn said. Or we can at least lean on the places where the world is thinner for the Paul. Silas, not a man given to metaphor unless it served a practical end, set his notebook open on one of the blue dots. Test me, he said. Ask me to list 3 things I did before noon. You installed 2 lights, Mara said. You bribed the diner to let you eat pie for breakfast, and you've been pretending not to notice the chalk circles. Silas tilted his head. 4. I let a crow sit on the cruiser's mirror without shooing it. Felt like a good omen. He blinked, surprised at how easily the story came. Off the blue tape, the words retreated a step. On the tape, they returned like dogs called home. Mara watched it all and thought of the nails in Winterglass Street laid underneath the plaster, the fasteners triggered closer together where the wall had once wanted to fly apart. Houses remembered resistance in their joinery. Maybe people did too. She imagined the town's verbs as screws seating, eat bite, call bite, walk bite, each one turning tight until the room held. At noon, they parted with assignments the way the living do when faced with slow disaster. Evelyn would map an imperative path across the green, the city hall steps, the ferry landing, with blue nodes where the air held. Jonah would teach command poems until his students hated him and themselves less. Silas would hunt for chalk circles. Mara would go back to the house that made time into a trick and declare small repairs out loud, as if announcing stitches before sewing them. No one said be careful. That phrase was useless here. They said call, text, eat something warm, rest. They hung up and meant it. As Mara locked her apartment door, she saw her new notes by the light switch and felt briefly like someone else had left them for her. Someone she could be. Someone she wanted to be on purpose. She read them aloud again, and the words behaved. The key slid, the door opened, the light inside declined to be anything but gray. Mara checked her watch as she stepped over the threshold. 10:12 m. She stood in the foyer for what felt like the length of a boiled egg. When she looked again, the hands had not advanced, but her calves had the ache of minutes lived. She said the time aloud, anchoring it, and took a picture of her watch like a tourist proving herself in front of an uncooperative landmark. The dining room's plaster had accumulated directives the way skin accumulates freckles. The words were practical, not prophetic, as if the wall had been recruited into a household's effort to keep breathing. Take a shower. Answer Maria. Stretch. Feed the fern. Lines pressed into lime like gentle bruises. Mara touched one and felt a cold that wasn't temperature, more like the cool of a closed library, where your voice automatically drops. She unpacked her tools, work lamp, tape measure, analog levels she trusted more than digits that might lie. Reseat the hinge, she said to the air, setting the tripod at the stairs. She said it again as she knelt and tested the screws. Reseat the hinge. She meant the laddering words to work like rhythm, like a sailor's chant as they hauled rope. When the last screw head aligned to a tidy vertical, the door swung true. The house made a small, grudging sound, as if the hinge had authoritative opinions. In the attic, the dust possessed its own weather. She found the notebook stuffed behind a joist, the paper swollen and thin. The first page read April 14th in a tidy, patient hand, beneath it a report. Rain. Soup on stove. Don't forget soap at store. The second page also read April 14th, same date, different weather, a different tone of misery. The third, April 14th again, but the ink had furred where a damp finger had tapped the words as if to settle them into place. 7 entries for the same day. 7 attempts to stake the day to itself. The last line, pressed so hard the graphite had embossed the page. If I write it down, it holds. If I don't, it takes the day back. Mara sat on the joist, legs astride the dark, and looked at the rafters. She thought of how with work, you could cut a scarf joint and make two flawed boards hold together as if they'd always been one. She whispered to the house the way you speak to an animal you have no right to command. I'm going to make a path through you, she said. It will be small, and it will be mine. On the second floor, the room with the iron bedstead waited. The light in its window seemed to have been sent to a different address and returned resentful. The word DONT on the wall had grown sharper, like a voice clearing its throat. Mara stepped close enough to smell lime and dust. She put her hand on the letters. Coolness found her palm, with the intimacy of a greeting withheld too long. What comes next? She asked. The corner where the dark preferred to think thickened. The presence didn't cross the floor. It deepened where it was, drawing edges toward itself until the corners of the room felt like the inside of a pocket. The bed clicked on metal contracting. The sensation that filled the room was not fear. It was gravity, reconsidered. Finish it, she said, surprised at how steady she sounded. Finish the sentence. Plaster yielded. The letters impressed themselves with a patience that felt obscene. Leave me. The phrase completed itself with a suddenness that made her mouth open. Don't leave me. Simple, human. The everyday plea of a person who had made it to April 14th 7 times in a row, and needed the next day to have a different number. She rested her forehead against the wall. I won't, she said. She did not specify for how long or by what measure. She hated promises that used eternity as punctuation. They'll come back tomorrow. The air in the room shifted a fraction, as if the house had found itself, briefly, less hungry. On the landing, her phone buzzed. A text from Silas, found 2 more chalk circles. 1 at the ferry, 1 outside City Hall. Blue taping nodes with Evelyn at 3. You in? She tapped yes and added, I found a sentence, then deleted the second part before sending. Some words felt private even when they weren't strictly hers. When she finally stepped back across the threshold to the porch and checked her watch, the hands had crept backward by a minute. She photographed the face again, then photographed the sky, then photographed the threshold itself, a line you could draw and call before and after. She wanted something she could hold against the house's appetite. The photos would do. They were nails driven through a thin board into a stud. As she walked to her truck, the shadow of 41 Winterglass slithered across the yard like an exhausted animal looking for shade and kept going until it touched the street. The new lamps on Maiden flicked on at the wrong hour, stubbornly, as if to say here is a circle with a dot. The hum in the archive grew into a tone that could have tuned an orchestra if the instruments had been built out of cardboard and hope. Evelyn had measured it with a borrowed frequency app which lied consistently, then with her bones which told the truth, but weren't calibrated. She laid blue painter's tape in small crosses where the air seemed most cooperative. When Jonah stepped onto one and began to read, the room paid attention. Stand, drink, text, light, step, sit, breathe. His voice was a thread knotted at both ends, running from his chest to the edge of the table and back. Silas brought in 3 residents one by one, a woman who had stopped doing her dishes and now could not recall whether she owned plates, a mechanic who had unlearned the order in which to put parts back, an elderly man who kept forgetting he had not said hello to his neighbor. At the taped nodes their faces changed, it brightening, not even lifting, but focusing. Wash 1 plate, Evelyn told the woman. Put it in the rack. Wipe 1 fork. Text me when it's done. She wrote her number on the back of an old library card and pressed it into the woman's palm. The woman nodded once, as if receiving a folded flag. She stood as if her knees had been reissued. The mechanic took out a smudge rag and held it like a passport. I used to talk to the parts, he admitted, cheeks pinking. Sometimes in Italian. My nonna had Italian. I never did. He looked embarrassed. Now I pick up a bolt and it's just quiet. Name 3 parts on the table, Jonah said gently. Even if you're wrong, name them like you're sure. The man touched each object. Cam, he said. Cap. Cover. The words were wrong but behaved like right words. They turned on, they made heat, they shone enough to see by. The mechanic's mouth twitched. I can work with that. A low, almost pleasurable shiver ran through the floor then, and for an instant Evelyn had the wicked sense that the building was proud of them. The standing wave seemed to steady, like a figure learning to hold a note. She marked new nodes and wrote in her neat block letters on index cards, water here, speak here, rest here. She pinned the cards to the town map with red-headed tacks that looked like drops of something cheerful. What are we fighting? Silas asked, not for the first time, and not for the last. Evelyn considered the ledger from 1902, the minister's letter, the 7 April 14 seconds, the chalk circles that kept appearing as if the sidewalk had decided to nominate itself for sainthood. Not a who, she said, a habit, the kind that thinks it's law. Mara, who had learned to tell the difference between load-bearing walls and walls that had just gotten used to being there, nodded. Then we build around it and through it and past it, she said, until it forgets it ever owned the room. Imperative paths, Evelyn said, pleased with the phrase as it left her mouth and found the table. They walked the proposed route at dusk, across the green where the flag moved reluctantly, down the brick path that knew fewer footsteps lately, past the statue of the woman with a basket of apples no one had touched in years because they didn't look edible. At the ferry landing, Evelyn placed a blue tape X where the planks had worn hollow. The river lay slack as fabric on a chair after you stand. On the post, beneath a frayed length of rope, a chalk circle waited for them, dot in the center, the mark confident as a signature. However's drawing them, Silas said softly, wants help. Or were the ones being helped, Jonah said. They stood together in the hush that comes when a plan is a boat you've pushed into the water, and have not yet climbed aboard. Above them, the new lamps came on with unnecessary courage. They put language on the table like tools and tried each one to see which fit the nut. The Paul eats verbs, Jonah said. Takes the middle of the day, the chewing parts, leaves the edges. We still are. We just stopped doing. It interrupts, Evelyn said. Picks up a sentence and removes the engine. She wrote DONT on a scrap of paper and slid it into the center of the table. Round it she placed cards the students had written: leave, speak, try, call, eat, wait. The DONT sat there like a lid. The other words looked patient, offended. Mara drew a little diagram of a wall. Joinery holds when you expect stress, she said. A scarf joint resists tension and compression. A mortise and tenon refuses a twist. If we know where the town twists, we set our joinery there. Silas, who had once learned the ways a crowd twists when fear starts, pointed at the map. Green, Danner, Paul, Ferry, the turn by the bakery where the ice builds up in February. He made lines with a pencil, then erased them and made different ones, laying the path where a body might actually choose to go if choosing felt heavy. We're building routes for tired feet. Then we need to anchor the verbs to places, Evelyn said, pinning index cards to intersections. Eat at the diner, she taped it right on the glass. Water at the spigot by the green with a plastic jug that anyone could refill. Sing at the steps of City Hall, where the acoustics flattered even ugly voices. She left call for the phone booth that no longer had a phone, and set a donated cell inside on a charger. A small heresy against nostalgia that made her breath catch with pride. Jonah took his class out with clipeboards. You're going to write instructions we can't ignore, he told them. Not rules. Invitations with vertebrae. They posted their words with painter's tape above doorbells and beside crosswalk buttons. People read them with the suspicion shaky days deserve and then, in 2s and 3s, did as told. The change was not a miracle. Miracles are tidy. This was municipal. The lights stayed on 2 hours longer before flickering. The woman with the dishes texted Evelyn a picture of a rack with 3 clean plates and a caption that read more tomorrow. The mechanic misnamed his parts and put an engine together that surprised the truck by starting. The elderly man, on his way to buy batteries, lifted a hand to the neighbor he always forgot and said hello as if the word had been waiting on his tongue all spring. Mara, passing 41 Winterglass in late afternoon, saw the house's shadow tucked closer to its porch, like a child who had been asked to keep their feet under their chair. She didn't go in, she said tomorrow to the latch as she walked by, and the word did a neat, small job in her throat. That night, they met in the archive and stacked their evidence like lumber, photo snippets of overheard sentences, a careful log of where the air held and where it dropped things. Between them, the pall pooled like unspent rain. It had not left, it leaned. Sometimes, it leaned on the right syllable, and a person forgot their own name for a heartbeat. We name it a habit, Evelyn said, and in naming, took from it some of the glamour monsters borrow when you call them king. We're not trying to kill it, Jonah said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. We're trying to teach it manners. Or a town, Silas said, is teaching itself. We're just writing it down. Mara packed her bag and slid the April 14th notebook into a folder the way you return a found thing to a safer pocket. She thought of the sentence on the wall. Don't leave me, and felt unreasonably superstitious about turning her back too quickly, as if she might walk out of the room, and the sentence would go back to being a hole. She glanced over her shoulder. The words were still there. Tomorrow, she said again and meant it. They posted the route on a corkboard outside City Hall with the solemnity of announcing a wedding. The flyer had Evelyn's tidy blocks, and Jonah's sudden loops where he'd corrected sing to sing louder. Silas taped the edges like a man expecting wind. Mara drew a small icon of a hinge where the path required a turn here. People came in ones, then in a filament of twos. Some wore the stare of those who had been living underwater too long, some held themselves like paper kept in a book to stay flat. The first to step onto the chalk circle was a boy still small enough to skip without shame. He skipped. The chalk held. His mother watched with a mouth that had forgotten it knew how to make a pleased shape. At the first note, a woman with a voice that had once been significant in a choir raised a hand. "It'll do it," she said. She took a card from Jonah and read, "Drink water." It wasn't stirring. It wasn't even poetic. People reached for the paper cups Evelyn had stacked. They swallowed. A man in a hat who had lost his taste for everything discovered that the water was nothing like nothing. It had weight, temperature, a little iron. He cried and no one applauded because that would have been rude. They moved as a town moves when it is not asked to be brave, only to be present. At the corner by Creel's, where the coffee smell had lately been a smell without invitation, Priya stood on blue tape and recited, "Text a friend." Phones blinked uncertainly, then lit like pond bulbs. Conversations began without wit. "Thinking of you. Here. Soup at the diner is okay today." A dozen small ropes thrown across a small river. The pall did not hide. It never had. It thickened at the edges like dough rising. Wherever a verb was spoken, it flinched it dramatically, just enough that the light gained an inch. People noticed. Someone laughed. The laugh carried as far as the green and stopped, as if the air had set up velvet ropes. At City Hall, they climbed the steps and felt, near the door, the place where the building's voice came up through the stones. Evelyn put her palm on it. "Sing," she said, and the word stirred something old in the lintels. A child sang the ABCs. An older man offered a war song with 3 lines he could remember and one he made up. The sounds didn't blend, they stacked. They built a cramped but serviceable shelter. The pall pressed, the shelter held. They crossed to the ferry landing. The river lay there with the quiet immodesty of a sit. Jonah took out the card he had not wanted to bring, the word that felt like a dare to the air. He kept it in his pocket for now. They weren't ready. He wasn't. He handed Priya a look instead, and she described the river aloud, flat as a plate, gray as a pencil, a seam where wind remembers how to stitch. People looked, and looking made the world consider its posture. Mara stood a little apart and counted the bolts in the dock's cleats. She murmured the numbers because numbers were instructions when you could not think of anything else to say. Silas moved through the group, quiet the way a shepherd explains to sheep that wolves exist without making panic into a second wolf. By the time they looped back to the green, the new lamps had come on and made halos on their own feet. The town did not cheer. It did not need to. Cheering was for endings. This was maintenance. They would walk again at dusk, and then again. Not because repetition would persuade the pall to leave, but because repetition, persistence, the polite cousin of stubbornness, was how towns reformed habits into rituals. And somewhere in the worsening sky, the storm that wouldn't be rain leaned closer to hear what verbs the humans would spend next. "Recite the hinge," Mara said, though the hinge had nothing left to prove. Rituals feed on familiarity. She needed the words as much as the door did. She took a level to a stubborn window, named the Bubbles Drift a hair left, and shimmied a sliver of cedar into the sash. "Plum," she said, not as a conclusion but as a wish the window oblige. "Upstairs don't leave me," waited on the wall like a bruise that had finally turned yellow. She touched the sentence with the softness a person reserves for scars they have decided to keep. I said I'd come back, she told it. I'm here. The Paul concentrated then it as spectacle, but as intent. The room's corners crept inward, not physically, but in the way your margin of error reduces when someone you love is ill. The dark didn't move toward her, it increased in itself until the rest of the world had to res-eyes. You can lean, Mara said, calm and furious. You don't get to rename me. She placed her palm flat on the plaster. The pressure answered curious greedy both. Silas, who had come by out of an instinct he could not make into a policy, called her name from the floor. Mara? The house's geometry changed at the sound. It didn't like to share. His voice arrived like a wedge you slide under a toppled bookcase to keep it from crushing the small animal below. Up here, Mara called and felt a slack in the room as if the Paul had turned to see who else had entered the conversation. Silas climbed. He was not a man easily startled. The sight of the wall with its pressed household commandments made his face adopt the stillness of men who have arrived too late before and promised themselves not to again. He stepped beside Mara without touching her and looked into the corner where the air had learned to be heavy. All right, he said softly to the absence. His voice was the sort you use with crowds and skittish horses. If you want weight, carry something for once. He held out his notebook, ridiculous and holy. Pages full of petty tasks of small, decent noticing. The Paul pressed against it like a cat pushing its face into a hand, and then harder. Silas absorbed the shove with a grunt that turned into a laugh at the end. He closed his fingers around the notebook as if it were a rope, and he at the edge of something that preferred edges. You can't have it, he said. But you can feel how heavy it is. The room recalibrated. The dark thinned by a fraction, the way liquid does when you tap the side of a measuring cup and bubbles rise. Finish your sentence, Mara told the wall. Nothing new wrote itself. Not everything did on command. Fine, she said. We'll finish it together. She stepped back and cow's superstition is what you have when science is tirade spout a little to the room. We're going to the ferry. Outside, the house sulked into its shadow like a child refusing but walking anyway. They joined the town at the green where Evelyn's map flapped, and Jonna's students handed out a fresh stack of verbs printed in type that did not apologize for itself. The storm had drawn up close now, not throwing lightning, as if it considered thunder vulgar. It simply convinced colors to forget their names. Mara walked with Silas. It wants to finish sentences, she said. Then we save some words for ourselves, he said. He didn't add please. You don't say please to weather. They reached the dock as the river chose a posture, and the ferry chose to agree. Faces turned in unison toward the place, where the Paul gathered between posts, above water, inside breath. Jonah, on the edge of the group, put a hand in his pocket and found the card he'd been afraid of. He closed his fist around it and felt paper become spine. Now or never, he whispered to no one and everyone. The storm came the day the river forgot to move. It had been holding steady for hours, water flattened until the ferry looked like a toy pressed into varnish. The sky wore its color inside out. The maples stood with the arrogant patience of things that had seen worse. In the archive, the low note rose until the fluorescent bulbs looked ready to crack and spill their cold blood. Evelyn switched them off. Candles failed to improve matters, their light felt like speech in a courtroom where everyone had already decided. Mara, Silas, Jonah, and Evelyn met at the top of the steps that led from City Hall to the green. People gathered, faces raw with a kind of wind that wasn't wind. The town's sounds had narrowed, no dog chains, no flag flap, no screen door slam. There was only breath and the quiet moan of air learning new rules. Mara, Silas, Jonah, and Evelyn met at the top of the steps that led from City Hall to the green. People gathered, faces raw with a kind of wind that wasn't wind. The town's sounds had narrowed, no dog chains, no flag flap, no screen door slam. There was only breath and the quiet moan of air learning new rules. It wants the last word, Jonah said. He held his stack of cards in both hands. The verbs looked too small to be weapons, but they were what swords had been before iron, ideas sharpened by use. Silas scanned the edges of the crowd for a shape that did not belong. It was everywhere because it was the absence between every two things. He hated it with the uncomplicated devotion he usually saved for broken systems. Hate wasn't a verb that helped. He put it down and picked up stand. Evelyn unrolled the town map and pinned it to the notice board with the thumbtacks that had once held bake sale announcements and firework warnings. The map looked tenderly foolish. A map always did, if you considered the hubris required to say here is the world, small enough to fold. We can anchor, she said. We can't win, but we can anchor. Hold on to each other's sentences. Mara had brought her father's pencil sharpener. It was old enough to be a talisman. She fed it a dull pencil. The shavings fell like curled words onto the step. If it eats verbs, she said, we'll feed it the wrong ones. Unmake, undo, unlearn. Let it choke. The idea felt reckless and good, like leaning out a window to test the air. The crowd parted. A woman came forward with a toddler on her hip, the child's hair electric with attention. The woman's eyes were the same color as the river when it kept its promises. I can't get him to nap or wake, she said, the tense wrong because the world had borrowed her grammar. I say sleep and it turns into sink. Then say rock, Jonah told her, without thinking. Say sing, say hold. The words struck sight. He saw the world accept the verbs as if they were small, bright nails driven home. The child's breath changed, softening into the rhythm of a boat that has decided to trust the dock. The woman's shoulders dropped half an inch. She began to cry without any fuss. The storm moved nearer. It did not announce itself with lightning or rain. It announced itself by making space for itself, shouldering ordinary weather aside. Street by street, shutters sighed. The 2 new lamps on Maiden hummed like tuning forks. The clock on City Hall shivered just enough for Evelyn to see it. Now, she said. We walk. They did. The imperative path circled the green and crossed the avenue, where the bakery's window held a tray of rolls no one had bothered to name with a card. At each note, a different voice read a card: drink water, call, look, step outside, breathe, eat. The Paul pushed back, making the verbs sound like mouthfuls of sand, but sound they did. People repeated them with the discardious persistence of the living. A murmur became a chorus. The sound gathered toward a center, like iron filings arranging themselves around a magnet. When they reached the ferry landing, the river lifted just a little reluctantly, like a sick man sitting up to prove he can. The ferry bumped the dock. Its rope laughed against the post in a sound so ordinary that several citizens made the embarrassingly public choice to smile. The Paul did not retreat in drama. It condensed. It made a figure on the dock, a gesture of a person, composed of absence and pressure. If you looked at it directly, it was a hole cut out of the day. If you looked a little beside it, you saw a heaviness fall on the world like the lid of a trunk. It had no face to read, yet Mara could tell when it looked at her. She felt her name tip on its axis. You don't get to finish our sentences, she said. She did not raise her voice because she was speaking to density, not distance. She stepped closer. The wood underfoot made the careful speaking noises that wood makes when it holds more than it should. It leaned. She leaned back. Silas stood at her shoulder without asking permission. If you want, wait. He told the thing tenderly, carry something for once. He held out his notebook. It looked absurd, a scrap of paper against a pressure system. The Paul paid it the kind of attention people reserve for rules written on free pamphlets. Then, curious, it pressed lightly in the offered chore. Silas gasped. The notebooks in his pockets, and on his shelves, and in his kitchen drawer, and the one he'd once thrown in the trash, all pulled at him as if they found their ancestor and wanted to be introduced. He steadied himself with the ferry rope. The rough hemp bit his palm, and that bite tethered him. Evelyn came to the other side, map under her arm, eyes fierce. I've traced you, she said to the absence. You're a grammar problem in a place that learned to live by lists. You think you're a law. You're a habit. She slapped the map on the dock. Stand on our names and see if you become one. It obliged. It pressed itself onto the map, onto the ink that spelled out streets named for the dead and for the trees that had died to make the map. The paper sank in the middle as if wet. The ink blurred, letters unhooking from lines, and for a moment it looked as though Greybridge would wash into shapelessness. But then each blur drew back into a letter, as if the town had decided it liked being told where it was after all. Jonah's turn. He had saved one card. He hadn't told the others the word, because saying it had scared him. He held it up now, like a priest holds bread. The card read Lev. The Paul pressed. The card bent without folding. The word did not sound the way it did when printed on motivational posters. It sounded like a nail through oak. It sounded like the first breath after being underwater too long. It sounded like the second breath, when you realized the first was not an accident. The dock groaned. The river shouldered the boat. The shape lost its edges for the first time, not disappearing but losing interest in being seen. It receded into the general heaviness the way a secret returns to silence after being nearly told. The storm broke it with rain, but with differences. The air remembered temperature. The candles ray lit back at the archive, made light that moved. Someone laughed, and the laugh kept its shape all the way to the end. They stood together and did not cheer. Relief came like a debt collector who had decided, for once, to forgive the smallest portion of what was owed. Is it over? Someone asked. No, Evelyn said. But it's daylight. They walked the town again. They did not say grand words. They said the little ones. Eat, open, text, call, walk, sit, sleep, wake. They said them the way you water plants, not expecting a miracle, expecting work. Hands moved. Doors unlatched. Lamps clicked. The Paul did not vanish. It learned the edges of where it could go without being asked to carry its portion. At 41 Winterglass, Mara stood in the upstairs room, where the iron bedstead waited like an old answer to a question that no longer fit. The wall still held the word DONT, and the finished sentence the house had given her, DONT leave me. She put her palm to the plaster. The cool felt like the hand of someone lying in a fever who asked you, with their eyes, to stay. She thought of all the notes she had written to herself, of Jonna's card bruising the air with lead, of Silas' notebook, of Evelyn's pinned map like a pin moth that had decided to fly anyway. She spoke not to the room and not to the town but to whatever in the world believed itself in charge of endings. You don't get ours, she said. The house exhaled. Not a happy sound. Not sad. Just less held. The corner where the dark had gathered learned the size of its own shadow and chose, for now, to be merely that, shade. Night came normally. The river moved. The ferry was late by a minute, which felt like a joke people were finally strong enough to smile at. In bed, Mara listened to the ordinary noises her apartment made, the refrigerator's small compressor sigh, the upstairs neighbor's shoes, the radiator's cough. Outside, the storm that had not been rain argued with itself in the distance. She almost slept. In the part of the night that refuses names, a pressure settled on the corner of the mattress the way a cat does, except heavier. The air leaned on her shoulder with a lover's entitlement. It had not left. It would not leave. Don't, she said softly. She did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. The darkness held, listening, as if even here, even now it wanted the end of the sentence very badly. It waited, hungry for the last word. Mara let the hunger pass through. She let it be weather. She lay very still, and did not give it what it wanted. Somewhere in the rooms of Greybridge, light timed itself to morning and clicked on. Somewhere else, a door opened because a hand had decided to turn a knob. Between those two small, irreversible events, the world continued. And in the listening quiet, the house at 41 Winterglass Street remembered how to take the morning without clenching.